Hey guys, I'm Dylan, and welcome to the LoLClash review, where we take a look at strategy in professional League of Legends. I wanted to thank everyone for the response for my first video. It was really cool that people saw potential in my work. This episode we're going to be talking about something I sort of touched on last episode, and that is how different teams utilize their junglers to press their advantages and sort of force plays onto their opponents. I've got a few games from the OGN Masters semifinals, as well as this week's NA We're going to take a look at how some of the Korean teams are really adept at forcing plays on their opponents, how CLG came up with a really cool team-wide strategy to apply jungle pressure, and how TSM seems to really be struggling to find a cohesive strategy to win the game. The first clips I have are from the OGN Masters semifinals between CJ and Samsung. It's worth mentioning that these are on patch 4.6 and not patch 4.8. For the sake of this video, I don't think it changes much other than the strength of Kha'Zix in the second clip. This first clip is from CJ Frost versus Samsung Galaxy Blue, and it sort of shows how we can press the early lane advantages of a character like Renekton to convert into kills and get ahead in the game. So we see here that they do manage to secure a 1v1 lane for their Renekton and do a pretty good job at chunking Shadow lane. So knowing that they have an advantage on the top side of the map, Lee Sin walks into the opponent's jungle. This was actually not really covered in the game because there was a bottom lane fight as well as a pretty long pause. But what Spirit actually does here is he goes and gets a pretty deep ward in the lane to cover for the counter gank. This makes it so as soon as Aurelia comes back into lane, he'll know whether a counter gank is a threat, and if the enemy jungler isn't there, they can pick up, as we see here, a pretty free tower dive. Shy kind of mistakenly teleports in, Lee Sin W's in, and they pick up a pretty free kill. What Spirit does next, I think, is a lot more impressive. Instead of going back to his base, like I think a lot of junglers would, or going and helping other lanes or something like that, he stays and tries to retain control of the topside jungle, as this is where his team is really strong and he can really force pressure onto his opponent. He runs to the mid lane, puts on a small gank, and then runs back in the top lane to initiate another tower dive. Shy doesn't really have any vision of his topside jungle, so he doesn't really know this is going to happen, and he comes in for another free kill and pick up the tower. This snowballs the game pretty heavily, and Samsung Blue goes on to win the game. Of course, plays like this don't always happen in a vacuum. There's always the other jungler to worry about, and the top laner can be smarter than Shy was in that clip. The top laner can go back, the jungler can come for a counter gank. So when we have strengths in the top lane specifically, it's important to note for these facts. This is why this second clip is probably my favorite clip of the week, and it shows how we can even use our strengths of our top laner and junglers to force 2v2s onto our opponent. So, as a prequel to this, we see that Daydream actually picks up a really nice first blood onto Eve in the mid lane with a good timed pink ward and a pretty good 2v2 fight. In addition to this, it sort of isn't covered in the clips, Aurelia manages to pick up an early level 6 due to some pretty good 1v2 rotations. So, knowing the strength of the Kha'Zix and the Aurelia, it's really cool what CJ Blaze does to sort of press their advantages. Aurelia teleports top lane immediately to secure the 1v1. So Kha'Zix at this point knows that he's really strong. He knows that his Aurelia is level 6, whereas the enemy Jax is level 5, so he knows he can really force kills onto their opponent. Instead of using normal jungle pathing and running through the river or running through lane in order to push the lane or initiate a tower dive, Kha'Zix runs into the topside jungle of their opponents and gets a deep ward at the enemy's wolves. This, again, as we saw in the first clip, protects them from the counter gank, and more specifically versus Eve, you can see if she's clearing the camp because otherwise she's going to be invisible. So the difference between this clip is, unlike the last clip, Samsung Galaxy Ozone is pretty aware that this is going to happen. Looper goes back to base as he sees the big wave coming, realizing that there's a pretty good possibility that a 2v1 dive is occurring. In addition to this, Eve runs up the top lane and goes to counter gank. Eve comes in for the counter gank, Jax jumps in, and they actually execute a 2v2 under the tower. This just shows how adept the Korean teams are at pressing their advantages and knowing where they can fight on the map. So, why are these plays generally in the top lane? First of all, for the purposes of this video, it's a lot easier to talk about forcing plays in the top lane because it's sort of isolated. It's sort of easy to analyze when a jungler goes into the enemy jungle, takes deep vision, and initiates a tower dive. But I think there's a lot of reasons that we see a lot of really aggressive top lane play and forced kills in the recent metagame. First of all, the bot lane and mid lane meta has shifted towards more passive champions. The introduction of Summoner Heal especially made the bot lane a lot harder to force plays on, whereas earlier in the season I think we saw a lot more aggressive 3v3s in the bottom lane. In addition to this, we're moving towards a few more picks that are more carry oriented in the top lane. When you have characters such as Aurelia and Jax, the top lane becomes a very, very volatile spot on the map. Forcing 2v1 tower dives or 2v2 tower dives on your opponent and getting ahead is a really, really good and reliable way to win the game. So, after looking at some of the Korean clips, we can kind of look at how some of the NALCS teams are trying to use these sort of plays and do the same sort of thing. So the first game I've got here is from CLG versus TSM, and we're going to see how CLG has a really cool team-wide strategy to sort of force plays onto their opponents. First, I want to take a look at the team comps of these two teams and identify where both teams have their strengths and where I think a lot of pressure is going to be in the early game. The first thing that really jumps out to me here is the Renekton versus Lulu top lane. Let's take a look at what happens in Korea when you pick top lane Lulu. You just get relentlessly tower dived. I think Lulu is still a very strong and viable top lane pick, but she has a very definitive weakness in that she's very weak to coordinated jungle ganks and coordinated jungle dives. So when I see an early aggressive laner such as Renekton on CLG against the top lane Lulu from Dyrus, I'd almost be certain that CLG has some sort of a plan to apply a lot of pressure onto the top lane. And we see that CLG does just this. They actually put together a really, really cool level 3 strategy to try and put a lot of early pressure onto the Lulu lane. So we see Dexter, after clearing his blue buff, goes immediately into the enemy's red buff to try and steal the red buff from Amazing, maybe chunk him down, or maybe even secure a kill. But what this strategy is really designed to do is take control over the top side of the map. Unfortunately, he really messes up the execution here. Misses his cocoon, misses his smite, and ends up getting out-dueled in the enemy jungle. So this is far from optimal and really gives TSM a chance to recover from what would have been a pretty awesome play if I think Dexter had pulled it off. I'd almost guarantee you would see Dexter initiating a top lane dive right after if he manages to secure the enemy red buff. A bit later in the game, we see that Dexter still, although his initial play didn't work, has the right idea and knows exactly the spots on the map that he should be pressuring. Dexter goes in to initiate a tower dive similar to the ones we saw of the Korean clips, and they are so confident in their ability to pull this one off that they pretty much just ignore the entire creep wave and go in for a really, really aggressive top lane. But you see, again, CLG really, really mis-executes these early aggressive plays, and they end up getting double killed under tower. They do pick up the first blood, so it's not a complete disaster, but this is definitely not what's supposed to happen. So despite, I think, a really good early game strategy from CLG, they really mis-execute their plan and give TSM a chance to get into this game. It's really important to note that while all of this is happening, TSM really didn't have anything to answer on the bottom half of the map and weren't aware of this early pressure top lane with an attempts to counter gank or gain vision to guard themselves over such plays. We see Amazing, as this is happening in the top lane, is in the enemy's bottom jungle while LeBlanc is back, sort of uncoordinated, and TSM just has really poor vision control over the bottom half of the map. Part of this has to do with play, I think. I think they just aren't as coordinated in setting up plays, and I think part of this also has to do with champion selection. Most notably, the really, really smart Alistar pick from CLG. As we can see here, CLG's bottom lane is designed to win lane by freezing in front of tower. Leona cannot engage onto the Alistar, and CLG can pretty much out-trade Kog'Maw throughout the entire early game. In the interview after the game, Aphromoo actually was talking about this and saying how they had a really good bottom lane to sit there, freeze in front of tower, and farm. And this is really cool because it completely meshes with what CLG wants to accomplish on the top half of the map. They have the bottom half of the map that can play very passively and still come out ahead, while they can press the early advantage of Renekton on the top half of the map. CLG ends up winning this game with some well-executed dragon fights and another top lane dive and good rotations sort of in the mid game. I don't think it had a lot to do with the early game strategy, but I think it's really important to analyze this and take a look at how CLG really came in with a really good plan to get ahead early, and how TSM really didn't seem to be either aware of this strategy or have an answer to it. I understand that Dyrus did outplay this top lane dive, but I think it was a lot more of these plays had to do with mis-execution on CLG's side rather than good strategical play from the side of TSM. Lastly, we're going to talk about TSM versus Dignitas, and what happens when you don't properly press your advantages on the map. This game also shows how all of this ties into win conditions, and how teams really need to be aware of how they're going to win the game. In this game, TSM had a really strong early game. They managed to secure a 2v1 lane for their Kog'Maw to bypass Kog'Maw's early laning phase, and managed to get Dyrus a 40 CS and 3 level advantage over Zion Spartan. So I'm just going to play this match in fast motion, and we're just going to see how TSM uses this strength of Shyvana to pressure the map and convert this huge advantage into something or anything. As we see here, Amazing does spend some time on the top half of the map, but TSM makes no concerted effort as a team to try and gain control of the top side of their jungle to force plays onto the enemy Jax, and instead trades a few objectives on the bottom half of the map and generally plays passively for the next 10-15 minutes of the game after getting this early advantage. So this isn't always a bad strategy. If your team is always going to win a late game team fight, I think it's okay to play conservatively, press 1 versus 1 in the top lane, and not really force plays onto your opponents. But I think it's always important to remind yourselves what your team's win condition is. In this game, I think Dignitas has a pretty big advantage in late game team fights due to their Jax and their Ziggs. They just have a very high damage team comp and are probably going to win the late game. I don't think it's impossible for TSM to win just single-handedly because of Kog'Maw. But I think it's a much better strategy for TSM in this case to try and pummel in the top half of the map instead of trading objectives and stalling this out to 35 minutes. And what actually ended up happening in this game is, well, the game stalled out to 35 minutes, TSM lost 2 team fights, and they got Nexus after the game being like 0-0 for the majority of, or 0-1, 0-0 for the majority of the game. We saw in the game TSM played versus CLG that they had difficulty taking initiative in creating plays and realizing where the focal and pressure points on the map were. And then we saw in the second game how, even though Dyrus got a huge advantage in the early game, they had a hard time converting that into an actual win. And I think a lot of this has to do with TSM's new roster swaps. With 2 new people on the team, I think it's kind of hard to coordinate a lot more strategical play and be aware of how the entire team is going to win the game. And I think some of that will come with time, but I do think this is something that plagued TSM in the past as well. They never really had a really strong grasp of forcing plays onto their opponents and strategical play, so I think it's something they probably need to work on. I'm interested to see how it's going to progress with this new roster, and I'm interested to see this entire week's games. There's going to be some pretty cool ones. That's all I have for this episode. I wanted to thank everyone for watching, if you got this far. I really don't have any ideas right now for next episode, so I'm obviously open to suggestions. I'll be watching this week's LCS intently and trying to analyze what's going on. If you guys really like what I'm doing, it would be awesome if you could follow me on Twitter or subscribe on YouTube. It really helps me get out my episode to more people. So that's it for this episode. Thank you.